Ashley Parker exhaled deeply, sinking into the plush cushions of her living room couch. A gentle afternoon breeze drifted through the half-open window, carrying with it the faint rustle of leaves. It was one of those rare days when time seemed to stretch, the world outside moving at a slower pace. Alone in her meticulously kept suburban home, Ashley sat in silence, her thoughts adrift. A half-empty cup of chamomile tea sat forgotten on the side table, its warmth long gone, a quiet reflection of the vibrant energy she once radiated. At 40, Ashley carried herself with effortless grace. Her auburn hair fell in soft waves past her shoulders, and her deep green eyes often betrayed a quiet introspection that revealed more than she intended. Life had been generous in material ways, but sparing in emotional fulfillment. She had no children of her own, but held a special place in her heart for Ethan, her 21-year-old godson. The son of her late best friend, Ethan had spent many summers under her roof, their bond growing stronger over the years. But as he matured and immersed himself in college life, their visits had become infrequent, almost ritualistic. Today, Ashley believed she was alone. After spending the morning organizing the kitchen and sifting through old photographs, she decided to indulge in a moment of solitude. Wrapped in her favorite silk robe, she settled into the sofa with a glass of wine. The subdued afternoon light cast long shadows across the room as she sipped the velvety liquid, savoring its rich flavor. Her thoughts wandered aimlessly, lulled by the quiet hum of the house. Unbeknownst to her, a car pulled into the driveway, followed by faint footsteps approaching the front door. Lost in her reverie, Ashley remained unaware of Ethan's return. He had come back to retrieve his phone, left behind during a brief visit the day before. Accustomed to her habit of leaving the door unlocked, Ethan entered without hesitation, expecting a quick in and out. The creak of the door shattered the silence like a needle tearing through fabric. Ashley jolted upright, her heart racing as she hastily adjusted her robe. Ethan stepped into the living room, his presence unexpected and unannounced. "Aunt," he began hesitantly, his voice faltering as he took in the scene. Ashley froze, her gaze locking with his. The weight of the moment pressed down on them both. She was acutely aware of how the silk clung to her form, its shimmering fabric catching the light in a way that made her feel exposed despite being fully covered. A flush crept up her cheeks as embarrassment surged through her. Ethan's wide eyes mirrored his own discomfort. "Ethan," she stammered, her voice trembling as she instinctively tightened the robe around herself. "What are you doing here?" He looked away, his ears turning red as he rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. I left my phone here yesterday," he mumbled, gesturing vaguely toward the kitchen before trailing off. The air between them grew thick with unspoken tension, neither sure how to navigate it. Ashley felt a rush of heat rise to her chest, her shame amplified by her vulnerability. Her mind raced for something, anything, to break the awkward silence. "You should have knocked," she said sharply, instantly regretting the edge in her tone. It came out harsher than she'd intended. Ethan's apology was immediate and sincere. "I didn't mean to intrude." Ashley exhaled slowly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear as she tried to steady herself. "It's fine," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "Just give me a moment." Ethan nodded and stepped back toward the doorway to give her space, but the discomfort lingered like an unwelcome guest. Ashley adjusted her robe and smoothed non-existent wrinkles from its fabric as she walked down the hallway. "I'll get your phone," she said, her voice steadier now as she fought to regain control. "It's on the kitchen counter," Ethan offered apologetically. Stepping into the kitchen, Ashley leaned against the cool granite countertop and took a deep breath to steady herself. The solid surface beneath her palms grounded her, but the memory of Ethan's expression's surprise mingled with something indefinable, played on repeat in her mind. She retrieved his phone, running her fingers over its smooth surface before exhaling slowly and regaining some semblance of composure. Returning to the living room, she handed it to him with a strained smile. "Here," she said simply, though her voice betrayed none of the turmoil churning inside. "Thanks," Ethan murmured softly. He hesitated for a moment, as if searching for words, but ultimately stayed silent. As their hands brushed during the exchange, a fleeting spark passed between them, brief yet undeniable. Ashley walked him to the door, each step measured and deliberate. She wanted this moment over, so she could retreat back into solitude and reclaim some semblance of peace. Ethan paused on the porch and turned to face her once more. I didn't mean to make things awkward, he said earnestly. I'm really sorry. Ashley offered a faint smile despite herself. His sincerity softened something within her, against all logic or reason, and it both comforted and unnerved her. Deep down, remnants of hope lingered where they shouldn't have survived after years spent building walls around herself. Walls that now felt fragile under unexpected scrutiny like this. It's okay, she said softly after what felt like an eternity of standing there, unsure yet unwilling to let go entirely. The way forward was unclear but undeniable. Pull, drawing them closer, persisted despite everything telling them otherwise. Just knock next time, she added lightly, teasing tone creeping into words. It broke spell momentarily before reality set again, reminding both boundaries needed maintain moving forward, regardless feelings involved. He gave a slight nod, smiling faintly before turning toward his car in the driveway. Ashley watched until the door closed behind him, then leaned heavily against the frame, exhaling deeply as she tried to process everything that had unfolded since his arrival earlier that day. The house felt different now, its usual stillness no longer comforting, but charged with an unfamiliar energy. She returned to the sofa, her tea cold and her wine untouched. Her mind raced, unable to escape the thoughts that had plagued her all afternoon. She had tried to dismiss the lingering sense that something had shifted between them, telling herself it was nothing more than an awkward moment that would fade with time. But deep down she knew better. The way Ethan had looked at her, and the way her heart had responded, was impossible to ignore. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, Ashley sat alone at the dining table. Her fingers traced absent circles on the polished wood, while the mantelpiece clock ticked faintly in the background. Though only minutes had passed since Ethan left, it felt like hours. The echo of his footsteps on the porch lingered in her mind, mingling with the emotions she had fought so hard to suppress. Her heart pounded relentlessly, refusing to calm. She stared at the table, her thoughts spiraling into a chaotic mix of confusion and embarrassment. The image of Ethan in the living room, his expression a blend of surprise and apology, replayed in her mind with cruel clarity. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she couldn't rationalize. Ashley rose abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as she pushed it back. She needed to move, to do something, anything, to ease the tension tightening around her. Her bare feet padded softly across the cool tiles as she wandered into the kitchen. Trembling, she reached for the sink and turned on the faucet. The rush of cold water provided a fleeting sense of grounding. She splashed it onto her face, letting the chill jolt back to reality, but the relief was short-lived. As she straightened, she caught her reflection in the window above the sink. The woman staring back at her was almost unrecognizable. Auburn hair, slightly disheveled, green eyes wide and searching, filled with an emotion she couldn't quite name: guilt, shame, or perhaps something deeper she wasn't ready to confront. The sound of a car engine revving in the driveway startled her from her thoughts. Ashley froze, her breath catching as she listened intently. The familiar creak of the front porch stairs followed, and her heart raced again. He had returned. Ethan didn't knock. The door opened silently. Moments later, he appeared in the kitchen doorway, his phone clutched in one hand. His expression was tentative, as his dark eyes scanned the room before settling on her. For several agonizing seconds, neither spoke. The silence between them was thick with unspoken tension. "I forgot my charger," he said finally, his voice subdued and uncertain. Ashley blinked, struggling to find words. "It's in the living room," she replied carefully. Ethan nodded, but lingered for a moment longer, his gaze conveying more curiosity than acknowledgement. Ashley inhaled deeply before turning and walking back into the living room. Her hands gripped the edge of the sink as she fought to regain her composure. From the next room came subtle sounds, the rustle of fabric, the faint creak of furniture, each one painfully mundane, yet charged with an intensity she couldn't ignore. When Ethan returned, charger in hand, he paused once more at the doorway. Ashley turned to face him instinctively, crossing her arms over her chest in a defensive gesture. Their eyes locked again for a moment. Everything else faded away, leaving only two dimly lit kitchen. "I didn't mean make things awkward," Ethan said, at last breaking silence, tone earnest, words measured, if treading delicate ground. "You didn't," Ashley replied quickly, though voice betrayed lack conviction. Ethan shifted weight between feet, fidgeting, charger cord. "I should have knocked," admitted quietly. Without thinking, nodded stiffly. "It's fine," said hoarsely. "Let's just forget happened." But even as spoke those empty words, knew forgetting wasn't option. Memory etched too deeply, mind way eyes widened, surprise when hands brushed, earlier afternoon, how stumbled over trying explain himself, how warmth flooded cheeks, heart raced wildly beneath ribs. Ethan glanced up again, dark met hers once more. There it was again, unspoken tension made hard either breathe properly. "I didn't want you feeling uncomfortable." Softly, "You didn't," repeated automatically, this time even less convincingly than before, because truthfully, was uncomfortable. Just not reasons possibly understand right now. The silence stretched between them like taut wire, ready snap under pressure, until finally broke eye contact, first clearing throat awkwardly before saying quietly, "I should go." His voice wavered slightly, breaking the heavy stillness that enveloped them. They stood rooted in place, neither able to move forward nor backward without risking further damage to their already fragile relationship. He turned toward the door, hesitated briefly, and glanced back over his shoulder one last time before murmuring, "Sorry, Aunt Ash." The childhood nickname struck her like a slap, a stark reminder of the boundaries separating them. Boundaries neither dared to cross, despite everything simmering beneath the surface, waiting to erupt at the slightest provocation. And then he was gone, leaving behind nothing but a deafening quiet that pressed down on her shoulders. She gripped the countertop, her knuckles whitening as she sought something solid to anchor her in the storm of emotions swirling within. Ashley had always prided herself on maintaining clear boundaries, but now they felt blurred, fragile, and indistinct. "It's all right," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Ethan nodded and left, the sound of the door closing behind him plunging the room into a heavy silence. She stood frozen, her hands clutching the edge of the counter as she stared at the empty doorway. Her mind raced, replaying every moment of their interaction with painful clarity. She tried to dismiss it, convincing herself it was just an awkward moment they'd both move past. Yet, deep down, she knew the tension between them wasn't something easily brushed aside. A small, undeniable flicker threatened to ignite something far more complicated than she was ready to face. As she turned off the kitchen light and retreated to her bedroom, she sensed this was only the beginning of a shift between them. Something nameless, yet impossible to ignore. Lying awake in the stillness of the night, she traced faint patterns of moonlight on the ceiling, wondering how long they could pretend nothing had changed. The atmosphere of the house had shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, clinging to the walls and lingering in the quiet spaces between them. Days passed since their uncomfortable encounter, yet the memory clung stubbornly to her thoughts, replaying with relentless precision no matter how hard she tried to suppress it. She told herself it was just a fleeting moment of embarrassment, but the tension remained palpable. She became hyper-aware of everything. The sound of Ethan's footsteps as he moved through the house seemed louder, more deliberate. His voice carried a weight she couldn't escape. Even their briefest exchanges in the hallway or casual remarks in the kitchen were laced with an unspoken tension neither dared to acknowledge. It was on a quiet Sunday afternoon that Ashley felt this burden most acutely. Seated on the living room sofa with a book in her lap, she realized she hadn't absorbed a single word. The text blurred as her thoughts spiraled into an inescapable reverie. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the dishwasher and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Ethan was upstairs, and though she hadn't seen him all morning, she was acutely aware of his presence. The faint creak of the staircase shattered the silence, sending a jolt through her. She tensed, her fingers tightening around the book as his footsteps drew closer. Forcing herself to relax, she inhaled deeply and glanced up just as Ethan entered the room. "Did you rest well?" he asked casually, though his voice held a hint of uncertainty. He ran a hand through his hair and lingered in the doorway, seemingly unsure whether to step inside or retreat. Ashley responded with equal restraint, closing the book and setting it aside as she sat up straighter. "Yes," she said, her tone measured but distant. Ethan hesitated for a moment before stepping further into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. Ashley watched him closely, her pulse quickening despite her efforts to remain composed. She hated how acutely aware she was of him, the way his dark eyes fixed on her, how his presence seemed to fill the space around them, both comforting and unsettling at once. She shifted slightly, crossing her legs in an attempt to appear nonchalant. "Do you want something to eat?" she asked, her tone overly cheerful and slightly forced. Ethan shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "No, I'm fine, thank you." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them like an invisible thread, tense and fragile, ready to snap at any moment. Ashley glanced at the coffee table, suddenly noticing the empty wine glass she'd forgotten to take back to the kitchen earlier. It felt like a glaring detail now, a small reminder of her vulnerability in recent days. "I was thinking of heading out," Ethan said finally, breaking the silence. "Maybe go for a walk or something." "That sounds nice," Ashley replied politely but distantly. She reached for her book again, opening it to where she'd left off. Though she knew she wouldn't be able to focus, Ethan hesitated as if waiting for her to say more. But when she didn't, he nodded and turned to leave. Ashley watched him go, feeling some of the tension in her chest ease as his footsteps faded down the hallway. But relief was short-lived. It was quickly replaced by a gnawing unease that refused to subside. Later that evening, Ashley found herself in the kitchen preparing dinner with meticulous precision. She chopped vegetables deliberately, finding solace in the rhythmic sound of the knife against the cutting board, a small comfort in an otherwise silent house. Ethan had returned from his walk hours ago, but had kept to himself since then. For that small mercy, Ashley was grateful. She was stirring a pot on the stove when she heard him enter behind her. She didn't turn around, but kept her focus on the stove as his presence drew closer, warm and palpable, filling the space around them effortlessly. "Smells good," he said softly, breaking the silence without warning or preamble, just as he always did. "Thanks," she replied curtly, sprinkling salt into the bubbling broth. Her fingers trembled ever so slightly, though she maintained an outward calm. "It'll be ready soon." The silence stretched between them until she glanced over her shoulder. Ethan leaned casually against the counter, arms crossed, his dark eyes watching her intently. Curiosity burned in his gaze, making her heart skip a beat beneath her ribcage. "You've been quiet today," he observed lightly, though there was a probing edge beneath his words. She shrugged and turned back to the stove, hiding her face as emotions churned inside her chest, threatening to spill over if she let them. "Just busy," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Busy avoiding me?" Ethan asked. His tone was light, but there was an edge to it that made her stomach twist. Ashley froze, her grip tightening on the spoon as she struggled to keep her composure. She forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow even to her. "Don't be ridiculous." Ethan pushed off the counter and stepped closer until he stood beside her. "Am I, though?" he asked, his voice lower now, more serious. Ashley turned to him, her heart pounding as their eyes met. "Ethan, what are you talking about?" "You know what I'm talking about," he said, his dark gaze searching hers. "Things have been different, and I think you feel it too." Ashley's breath caught as her mind raced for the right words. She wanted to deny it, to tell him he was imagining things, but the truth was undeniable, a quiet tension that had been building for days. "I think you're reading too much into this," she said finally, her voice shaky. She turned back to the stove, hoping to end the conversation. But Ethan didn't move. "Maybe," he said softly, "but maybe I'm not." Ashley gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white as she fought to keep her composure. The weight of his presence and the intensity in his voice were overwhelming. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that made her want to retreat. "Dinner's ready," she said abruptly, her voice louder than necessary. She turned off the stove and reached for the plates. Her movements hurried. Ethan didn't press further, but as they sat down to eat, the silence between them spoke volumes. The tension that had settled over the house wasn't going anywhere, and Ashley knew it was only a matter of time before it came to a head. The evening was unnervingly still, the kind of quiet that amplified every creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind outside. The house felt smaller somehow, its walls closing in as Ashley moved through it, each step heavy with the weight of the past few days. She had tried to shake off the unease that had settled over her, to brush aside moments that lingered like unanswered questions. But tonight, the tension was impossible to ignore. The soft glow of the living room lamp cast long shadows across the walls as Ashley sat on the edge of the sofa, nervously toying with the hem of her sweater. The book she had been pretending to read lay abandoned on the coffee table, its pages open to a chapter she couldn't recall starting. Her mind was elsewhere, consumed by fragments of conversations and fleeting glances exchanged with Ethan. He was upstairs. She knew this from the faint murmur of his footsteps he moved around his room, a steady rhythm that both comforted and unsettled her. She had avoided him all day, finding excuses to keep busy. But now, as the house settled into its nightly stillness, there was no escaping the thoughts that plagued her. Ashley exhaled sharply and ran a hand through her hair, trying to steady herself. She told herself she was overthinking, reading too much into every interaction. But the memory of Ethan's gaze in the kitchen lingered, intense and searching, igniting something in her that refused to be extinguished no matter how hard she tried. The creak of the stairs pulled Ashley from her thoughts. Her breath hitched as she looked toward the doorway, her heart pounding in anticipation. A moment later, Ethan appeared in the soft light spilling from the hallway. He hesitated briefly before meeting her gaze with his own dark eyes, and for a moment the silence between them felt almost deafening. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked quietly, his tone tentative yet deliberate enough not to startle her too much at first glance. Still, though, it did just enough damage without being overtly aggressive or confrontational about things either way. Ashley jolted upright at his words, her wide eyes locking onto his in an instant. The suddenness of it all caught her off guard, shattering the quiet that had enveloped them earlier in the evening. "I haven't," she blurted out quickly, but not quickly enough. Ethan raised an eyebrow, his expression a mix of amusement and knowing. "You have," he said firmly, yet his tone carried a kindness that softened the words. A subtle smile played at the corners of his lips, hinting at their long-standing familiarity. "And I think we both know why." A blush crept up her cheeks as a storm of emotion swirled within her, shame, frustration, and something deeper she couldn't quite name. "Ethan, I don't know what you're talking about," she said guardedly, her voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside. "Yes, you do," he replied without hesitation, "this thing happening between us. You feel it too." The question hung in the air like a spark, waiting to ignite, undeniable and electric. It wasn't just excitement. It was a reckoning demanding confrontation or retreat. Yet beneath it lay vulnerability, a fragile thread of uncertainty pressing on her chest with every breath. This wasn't just a question, it was a crossroads where every choice would change everything forevermore. A shudder raced down her spine, leaving her feeling exposed. She stood abruptly, putting distance between them as she crossed the room. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice trembling. "You're overthinking this." "We both are." Ethan rose cautiously, closing the gap between them. "Am I?" he asked, his tone subdued. Ashley turned to face him, her pulse quickening as their eyes locked. His gaze held an intensity that both frightened and thrilled her. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could find the words, Ethan reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. The touch sent a jolt through her. She froze, her breath catching as she stared at their hands. She should have pulled away. She should have stopped this before it went any further. But she couldn't. The weight of the moment and the emotions simmering between them held her captive. "Please, Ashley," Ethan murmured, his voice barely audible. "Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me you don't feel it too." She searched his eyes, desperate for clarity. But all she found was raw sincerity, leaving her more exposed than ever. "Ethan," she began, her voice shaking, "this isn't right." "But it feels right," he replied, his tone gentle yet unwavering. "Doesn't it?" Her resolve faltered as the walls she had built began to crumble under the weight of his words. She wanted to deny it, to push him away, but the truth was undeniable. In some inexplicable way, it did feel right, defying logic and reason. She closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "I don't know," she whispered. Ethan raised his hand, cradling her face as he gently wiped away the tear. "Yes, you do," he said softly, "and I think you always have." The tension between them reached its breaking point, the barriers they had carefully maintained dissolving into raw emotion and unspoken connection. Ashley's breath hitched as Ethan leaned closer, his movements deliberate, giving her every chance to retreat. But she stayed rooted in place, and then everything shifted. The night was unnervingly still, the silence pressing in from every corner of the house. Outside, the moon hung low in the sky, its pale light stretching long shadows across the lawn. Inside, the air was thick with a tension that had been building for days, a quiet storm on the verge of breaking. Ashley sat at the dining table, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her untouched wineglass. The room was bathed in the warm glow of the chandelier above, casting soft shadows across her face. She tried to distract herself with mundane tasks, answering emails, flipping through a magazine, but her mind refused to settle. The events of the past week replayed in her mind like an unrelenting film reel, each glance, each word, adding to the storm of emotions she struggled to contain. The faint creak of the stairs alerted her before she saw him. Her heart quickened with a familiar thrum, one she had come to dread, and if she were honest, anticipate. She looked up, just as Ethan stepped into the room, his presence commanding even in the quiet simplicity of the moment. He hesitated in the doorway, hands shoved into his jeans pockets, his dark eyes scanning the room before settling on her. There was an intensity in his gaze tonight that made her pulse race. "I couldn't sleep," he said finally. Ashley forced a faint smile, though her thoughts were anything but calm. "Neither could I." He nodded, pulled out a chair opposite her, and sat down. The broad wooden table between them felt like a fragile barrier now. For a long while neither spoke. The silence grew heavy, teetering on the edge of unbearable. Finally, Ethan broke it. "I need to say something," he began, his voice low but resolute. Ashley's chest tightened as she set her glass down carefully, her fingers trembling slightly. "Ethan, please," he interrupted, his eyes locked on hers. "I can't keep this in anymore." She froze, her breath catching as she watched him struggle to find the words. His expression held a rawness that tugged at something deep within her. "I don't know when it started," he said quietly, passion threading through his words. "Maybe it was that night in the kitchen, or maybe it was long before that. All I know is that something has changed, something I can't ignore anymore." Ashley's stomach twisted with a mix of fear and something else she couldn't name. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "Yes," he insisted, leaning forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were his only anchor. The room seemed to shrink around them as Ashley's thoughts raced wildly. She wanted to stop him, to look away, but she remained transfixed by his words, his gaze, his very presence. "I think about you all the time," he admitted quietly but fervently. "When I'm with you, nothing else matters. And when I'm not, all I want is to be near you." Her breath caught again. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure he could hear it too. "Ethan," she whispered shakily when she finally found the strength to speak again. "We can't." He shook his head almost pleadingly. "Why keep pretending? Why deny what we both know?" "Complexity," she replied softly, then added after a pause. "It's unjust, yet it feels appropriate." Ethan's gaze held hers, steady and unrelenting. "You can't pretend you don't feel it too, Ashley." She looked away, her hands tightening in her lap as she fought to steady her breathing. The truth hovered between them, impossible to ignore. She felt it, the pull, the spark, the strange gravity that seemed to bind them together. But acknowledging it felt like stepping into the unknown, and she wasn't ready to take that leap. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Ethan stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as he moved around the table. He stopped beside her, his presence both commanding and gentle, as he reached for her hand. "You do know," he said softly. "Just like I do." His touch was warm and firm, grounding her in a moment that felt perilously fragile. Tears welled in Ashley's eyes as emotions surged within her. She looked up at him, her breath catching when their eyes met. "This isn't fair," she murmured, her voice trembling. "To me, fairness doesn't matter," Ethan replied, his tone calm but unwavering. "What matters is what's real." Ashley closed her eyes, a single tear tracing its way down her cheek. The walls she had built so carefully were crumbling, and she didn't know how to stop it. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice breaking. "You don't have to figure it out alone," Ethan said, his grip on her hand tightening. "We'll face this together." Silence settled over the room, heavy and suffocating. Ashley's mind raced with conflicting emotions. Guilt, confusion, longing, each pulling her in a different direction. She wanted to believe him, to trust in what they shared, but the fear of what lay ahead held her back. The night stretched on, each moment thick with unspoken promises and unanswered questions. Ashley wondered if she had already crossed a line from which there was no return. Sunlight seeped through the curtains, soft and golden, bathing the room in muted light. Ashley stirred awake, blinking as the world outside came into focus. For a moment she lay still, suspended between sleep and consciousness. Then reality crashed over her like a wave. The memories of the previous night flooded back with startling clarity, quickening her pulse. She sat up slowly, pressing her hands to her face, as if to shield herself from the weight of it all. The house was eerily quiet. Every creak of the floorboards and rustle of leaves outside seemed magnified in the stillness. Ashley let her hands fall to her lap and turned toward the window. The sky was clear, the sun rising steadily as if indifferent to the storm raging inside her. Every word Ethan had spoken echoed in her mind, his confession, his touch, the vulnerability in his eyes, all etched into her memory with painful precision. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, her bare feet meeting the cool wooden floor. Wrapping her arms around herself for comfort, she made her way to the bathroom. The mirror reflected a version of herself she barely recognized, her auburn hair tangled, her green eyes shadowed from a restless night. She splashed cold water on her face, hoping to ease the tightness in her chest, but the relief was fleeting. Returning to the bedroom, Ashley's gaze fell on the chair by the window where her sweater lay draped, the same one Ethan had brushed against when he crouched beside her last night. The memory sent a jolt through her, and she shook her head as if to scatter the thoughts crowding her mind. The faint clink of dishes downstairs broke the silence. She froze. Realization hit she wasn't alone. Ethan's presence was palpable even from a distance, twisting her stomach with a mix of anticipation and dread. Drawing a steadying breath, she descended the stairs. The kitchen was bathed in sunlight, its warmth highlighting the room's simplicity. Ethan stood at the counter with his back to her, his movements deliberate as he prepared coffee. He was dressed casually, his dark hair slightly disheveled, a sign he too had spent a restless night. The sight of him, familiar yet changed, made her pause in the doorway. "Morning," she said finally, her voice softer than she intended. Ethan glanced up briefly before returning to his task. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched between them like a fragile thread until he offered a tentative smile. Ashley stepped into the room cautiously, as if navigating a minefield. Reaching for a mug from the cabinet above him, she sidestepped awkwardly to avoid brushing past him, a small gesture that only highlighted the tension still lingering between them. Her hand froze midair as Ethan stepped closer, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "I understand your fear," he said softly but firmly. "I feel it too, but that doesn't change how I feel." "We'll figure it out," he said gently. Ashley glanced down at their hands, her breath hitching as she wrestled with the tempest raging within. The urge to retreat into denial, to shove it all aside, clawed at her, but she couldn't. The connection between them ran too deep. "We can't rush this," she murmured at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have to be careful." Ethan nodded, his expression earnest. "I get it. I'll follow your lead, no matter what. You don't have to face this alone." The sincerity in his words and the steady support in his eyes made her chest tighten. She drew a deep breath, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter for stability. "We'll talk later," she said finally, her tone more resolute now. "I need time to think." "Take all the time you need," Ethan replied softly, his voice calm and reassuring. As he stepped out of the room, Ashley stood alone. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the floor as she lifted her coffee cup to her lips. The warmth of the drink anchored her as she gazed out at the world beyond the glass. The future was uncertain, but one thing was undeniable. Everything had shifted, and there was no turning back.